Welcome to People and Profit. I'm Kate Moody. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is derailing the global economy's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is the latest to slash its forecast for 2022 from 4.5% projected in December to just 3% in its latest outlook. That's largely in line with similar forecasts by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which have drastically scaled back their pre-war projections to 2.9 and 3.6% expansion, respectively. Driving that slowdown is the cost of living crisis that's impacting households and businesses around the world. The OECD forecasts inflation across its 38 member states will average 8.5% this year, 7% in the Eurozone. Inflation in the UK is trending higher, while the US is set to level out at 5.9% this year. Turkey has the highest projected inflation at 72%. Soaring energy prices have been driving that trend, while higher commodity prices and supply disruptions are threatening a food crisis in many low-income countries. Let's speak now to Laurence Boone, Deputy Secretary General and Chief Economist at the OECD. You've authored the editorial in this latest outlook called The Price of War. As you point out there, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has prompted a humanitarian disaster. It's killed thousands and forced millions of Ukrainians to flee their homes. When it comes to the economic price, the European Union is very much on the front line, and that's partly because of its reliance on Russian energy.
So indeed, Europe is relying quite heavily on Russian energy, both coal, oil and gas. There has been some reduction in oil and coal, and there will be more, as you know, which we take into account into this outlook. And for the gas, it's quite specific for the EU. But what I would like to say is that for the world as a whole, oil prices do matter. So the world as a whole is paying a price for Russia's aggression in Ukraine.
And that region in particular, of course, Russia, Ukraine, and the neighboring countries paying an even higher price.
Yes, the dependence that is arising partly from trade and energy, but also the impact on consumer confidence, the impact of inflation on consumers' purchasing power and living standards is obviously having some effect, which is higher in the EU. Having said that, the war is sending, shockwaves way beyond Europe, all the way to Africa and the Middle East, because the price of cereals has also shot up following the war in Russia and Ukraine, because they're huge commodity exporters. So it's not only Europe, it's really radiating across the world.
Now, you've called for governments to help the most vulnerable households deal with inflation with very targeted aid measures. Do you think policymakers are indeed taking those right steps?
So we've seen a lot of policymakers taking many steps, I should say, to protect consumers, sometimes with broad-based measure and sometimes with more targeted measures. So now, in the emergency of a war, it's perfectly understandable that policymakers just want to act swiftly and efficiently with efficacy, so they do broad-based measure. It's easier. But if the war lasts longer, if tension persists, then they will have to target better towards not only the most vulnerable, but also the lower income, medium-class people who suffer quite heavily from the rise in inflation, including and especially food and energy, which are the most basic items on which we spend every day.
So here in France, for example, the government has been giving direct financial aid in the form of energy and food checks to the lowest income households. Is that the right kind of policy?
But this, as I said, has been easy and very efficient quickly. Obviously, it has also helped to keep inflation in check. Inflation measured in France is lower than the average of the Eurozone. But this is something that is by nature temporary because it's quite costly from a fiscal standpoint. And so moving into 23, if the war persists, then I expect that there will be some rescaling of the measures.
Now, disruptions in key supplies of commodities from Ukraine and Russia have worsened the effects of drought and conflict in many countries. Your report calls for greater international cooperation to avoid a global food crisis. Is it too late?
It's not too late because we have enough food, enough cereals globally to actually feed the population. The difficulty we have is that some countries are hoarding some of these cereals, and they are transport and distribution logistics issue. So the first thing that we're asking is no more barriers to trade of these basic goods. The second one is for advanced economies to actually manage the distribution of cereals to the countries and people that need it. You know, it's not the same to transport things from Russia than it is when it has to come from the other side of the planet. And ultimately, prices are super high. So advanced economies need to help financially. The Middle East and Africa, for example, who are very hurt and very dependent on Russia and Ukraine cereals. You know, we've not been very good as advanced economies with vaccine distribution post-COVID. I think we should do a lot better for cereals and food this time.
To your point on export controls, we have seen India, for example, banning wheat imports. Indonesia, for a while, halted exports of palm oil. How do you respond to those governments who say that they're simply trying to protect their own populations?
So as I was... It's an excellent question. And as I was saying, food prices are super high. So it can be a natural move and instinct to actually close your border for those countries who need the food and cannot afford market prices. Again, if this multiplies, this is not a solution. It's pushing prices up globally, and that's not helping solve the issue. But we're insisting on the fact that advanced economies have a huge role to play to distribute, to bring the cereals from where they are to the people who need it. And there are a lot of them which are net exporters from Australia to the US and even Europe.
Now, the war in Ukraine has really pushed the COVID pandemic into a pretty distant second place in terms of issues that we talk about affecting the global economy. China, in particular, though, is still really cracking down on cases with that zero COVID policy, and that's still impacting global manufacturing, trade, and growth.
Yeah, this is very important. The lack of vaccination in China and the zero COVID policy means that they're shutting on and off production and the country. So this is detrimental to their own economies, and it's detrimental to the global economy. It's creating bottlenecks in ports, in global supply chain. China's really moving from being the world growth engine to being the world volatility engine.
Governments around the world have been racking up debt during the pandemic, and now with these inflation aid measures. Will that affect future investment in areas like education, health, and sustainable energy?
So there's one thing which is quite new in the post-pandemic world, which is that obviously debt are higher because of all the pandemic support that was provided to people and firms, and that was appropriate. But we're seeing it declining already. And the deficits that had widened during the pandemic, they're back to where they were before the pandemic. So I think public finances have been managed pretty well during the pandemic. And obviously, we would like this to continue looking forward. We will have new demand for investment, defense, energy transition. We have the necessity of protecting lower income earners. So what we're simply saying to policymakers is they should make sure, they should review spending so that they can shift it to all the priorities that they think are the top one, while protecting the vulnerable people, as we've discussed.
Do you think these dual crises of pandemic followed by war represent a turning point for the era of globalization?
I actually think that there's a lot of talks about it, but there are a lot of reasons to be careful when discussing it. Let me give you the example of energy transition. A lot of low-emission energy and transport infrastructure actually requires minerals, metals like copper, nickel, rare earths that are coming from all over the world. It's in fact the production chain for low-emission energy and transport infrastructure are more demanding of material that's coming from the rest of the world than fossil fuel. So we will need some globalization to actually achieve the energy transition. And we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but be careful in the way that we are organizing these global value chains.
The World Bank has warned that we're heading into a period of stagflation, stagnated economic growth and very high inflation like we saw back in the 1970s. Do you agree with that description?
Well, actually, we have growth of 3% for the world this year, which is surrounded by downside risk, but still quite some growth. We have high employment, low unemployment rate. So that's an economic situation that is uncertain, but it is not that bad. Inflation is also very different from what we have had in the 70s. It's not the same word, we shouldn't be brought back there. Back then, inflation was allowed to rise for several years in a row. Just as an example, in the US, it was above 5% for more than 6 years. Now, today, the central banks are acting much more quickly, and that is also a marked difference from the 70s.
Laurence Boone, thank you so much for joining us on People and Profit today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And that's all for now. Don't forget to get in touch with your comments and questions on social media. Until next time, thanks for watching.